Okay, this presentation is the last chapter of the book that I didn't write because the editor told us it was time to quit and send the book off. So we did, and it's taken me about 2 years to try to figure out how the pieces of the book come together. It's got a, it has chapters essentially about every subfield in moral psychology, running from evolution and neuroscience all the way up to cultural differences, personality, moral identity, the self, skills and knowledge. And each of those has its own really large literature in it. It took my philosopher wife and I 14 years to get through all of these things. It was essentially like writing 14 annual review of psychology articles in order to cover the literatures. And then they wanted me to teach at St. Olaf College at the same time. What I'm bringing to you is a mapping of the field of moral psychology that, having done that literature review with my co-author, actually helps us to make. And one of the things we actually note within the first, I think it's on the second page of the introduction, is that it's a fragmented field. And that was 2 years ago that it first came out. And I think that line was in the introduction 3 years before that in an early version. Because the sub-areas are siloed. They often don't cite each other. And one of the advantages of the book is it's constantly citing back and forth between chapters about how things are connected to each other. This lovely picture is a map of the volcano Chimborazo in Ecuador that Alexander von Humboldt made when he was first there in the early 1800s. He was what we would today call a natural scientist, but he was on the, and others now would call it, actually now it has been called Humboldtian science by the historians after Alexander von Humboldt. And what he did was he made cartography a part of the science of ecology. He's been called one of the first ecologists, particularly as he looked at the influence of humans on some of the various lakes surrounding this volcano. He maps the vegetation at various heights and climate aspects, soil conditions, all sorts of things, all together so that you can see the connections among them. And that's what I'm going to try to do, is a mapping of the field of moral psychology based on having too many references in this text. So here's just an example of some of the fragmentation in the field. In the personality chapter, on the way to the publication of the book, it went out to editorial review. And in the personality chapter that was sent out, I made this simplistic approach to character, which you often actually still see, which is that the virtuous person acts the way they do because of the character they have. And the editorial reviewer, social psychologist Jessica Salvatore, said no serious psychologist would ever think that. Would ever think that moral action derives primarily from traits. And then when Christopher Miller, the philosopher who works on character, reviewed the book in Notre Dame Philosophical Review, he said this. This rejection of virtues as real, psychologically real dispositions which are causal stands against the approach of the work of most philosophers in character today. And so I got caught in the middle of a disciplinary disagreement about the role of character. And I think it was our statement that virtues aren't what make us virtuous. And by make, I meant they're not involved in the causal processes of how we become virtuous. And so since that review, I've been trying to figure out what the right response to it is. And first, I just wanted to write a response to that issue. And it occurred to me that I can't just say, well, it's more complicated than that. What I had to do is show how it is more complicated. And I've used work from the book and some new conceptions that we've come up with. So I want to show those to you. I think, frankly, both Salvatore and Miller are capturing something true about the world. And the psychologist here will recognize the Piaget Three Mountains task, which is two observers. One is the child's doll and the other is the child. And the child, as they grow up, eventually learns that someone else has a perspective. My daughter has had to learn this so that she doesn't put her head in front of me while I'm reading her a book. And so we have a landscape in the middle, and my proposal is that these two positions are looking at that landscape from different perspectives. And that if we were to get an understanding of the full landscape, then we would know how those perspectives might fit together and interact, and we might discover new places that we hadn't thought about before. These have been sort of systematized, first in Christian Miller's mixed virtues approach, in which he talks, he uses some work in personality and trait theory to claim that virtues are just incomplete traits. And if what you do is practice them over time, then they become organized and become causally effective in producing behavior. And John Doris's approach has been primarily a negative one, which is to suggest, no, I'm sorry, that doesn't work. Situations are far too powerful. This is something people have been saying since a review book by Nisbet and Ross back in early 1980s, that situations are really quite powerful in pushing moral behavior. And I think, frankly, that any adequate account of moral psychology is going to have to explain both of these perspectives instead of having to figure out which one is right. Miller's approach makes a variation in virtue or variation in responses the problem. It's not the thing he wants to explain. Doris's approach ends up making the possibility of critique problematic. Because if the situation is what's really controlling most of it, how do people change things? Like our authors Dan and Michael yesterday were talking about with somebody has to do something. And so I think a complete moral psychology needs to be able to encompass those in a landscape. And that's why I'm referring to von Humboldt. So here is the distributed moral import hypothesis. Moral action emerges from the distributed coordination of moral commitment. Hello. In response to moral import across psychological and ecological domains. Now let me say something about what that means. This is an example of a little landscape. We're going to get a bigger one in a moment. But these are the domains of response and commitment, and essentially they're taken out of the chapters of the book. And what I do is break out moral ecology because there are so many aspects to moral ecology in the table. These are forms of moral import, and that's what we're going to talk about first, because this is the input into into the model. Again, I want to emphasize, I'm not proposing any process models here. All I'm doing is trying to map the landscape that's going to construct constraints for what we'll make for good process models in moral psychology. So moral import experiences are normatively significant experiences that call for some response. Let me give an example. Here are several. They're in alphabetical order. You'll notice that they're usefully color coordinated, and we're going to work on that in a minute. There are a lot of concepts like this, or emotions, or experiences. My wife is a philosopher, and she likes to work on the conceptual aspects of things. But as a continental philosopher, she also cares deeply about phenomenology. And that's where we're going with this, is to think about the phenomenology of having a moral demand. And each of these has a different phenomenology. And it comes to us through different aspects of the capacities that we have. Our emotional capacities, our cognitive capacities, the skills that we have learned. So how do we get this set of moral import experiences? My list currently includes a little over 50 of them, as I have been trying to generate thinking about both positive and negative experiences like revenge. And I just learned one yesterday from Anne Pizor, the idea of ownership, that I feel I have to include. And it's a thing that my daughter has learned when she was 3. It's mine. And that has some claim on us. And it's that feeling of the claim that I'm talking about, the phenomenology of. How does that grasp us? So first, to get on the list, what you need is to pass Richard Schwader's objective moral charter, which is that it can't just be a preference. It needs to be something that makes a claim with binding force on relevant others. It could be a claim on what fathers should be like. It could be a claim on how nurses should act, or it could be a claim on how humans ought to act. But it needs to act as a binding claim on a rate. And this, Schwader argues, is a cultural universal, that all cultures have this aspect of morality as a part of them. You can also see it in some of Kohlberg's work on universalizability, and on Skitka's work on the moral pressure of demands. And I particularly appreciate that work because it also talks about the dark side of these moral demands. And then it needs to be appropriable. And here what I'm doing is trying to hold off causality. It doesn't just produce it, although some of the situational things do produce it. We're going to talk about how that works. But it needs to be appropriable by someone and present itself as a claim on me. Now, Kierkegaard spent a great deal of time talking about the gospel for me or truth for me. And he has a very nice analysis of it. But you also see this in models of meaning in life, like DC and Ryan's and Blasi's understanding of identity. It's really about these moral claims for me. And my claim is that any experience that meets these two criteria is going to function like a moral claim. That is, it's going to shape condemnation, it's going to shape social trust, and it's going to shape accountability in recognizable ways. Some of them will even shape things like contagion, where you don't want to be involved with a person or to touch anything that they have touched. Some of that very interesting early work on disgust. And so you can take, here's where the color coding comes in. You can take the various 50 moral import experiences and you can cluster them together in how they feel the same or they function the same. I'm not committed to affect and identity being together. I'm perfectly happy to come up with different clusters. But my point is that they can cluster some, and you'll be able to use those clusters to think about how they take their hold on in human psychology and human action. And they do that through what I'm calling grounding. Now here I'm not talking about what philosophers usually call metaphysical grounding, which gets us to the issues of causality. Instead, I'm talking about a more generalized grounding where you can argue about it and that supports its role in our life, or it feels binding in some way and that supports its role in our life, or and here I'm thankful to Dan and Michael for their work on Somebody Should Do Something, because they talk a great deal about how roles and a variety of other things actually incorporate some of these moral import experiences as part of what it means to be a father or a sibling, etc. But they also get incorporated in skills. If you're a nurse, you practice compassion in a particularly skilled way, in a way that will be automatic. You don't say, oh, it's time for compassion now. It is just the part of the routine that you do. Moral demands are incorporated in decision-making in mortgage granting. And that gets its way into software, which is the place that's been my sandbox, is ethical aspects of software engineering. So I've said most of these things. I want to mention these different kinds of moral grounding are interactive with each other. And I think the easiest example is the kind of cases that we were looking at yesterday. They are called by Daniel Dennett intuition pumps. And what they are is they produce the, oh, that's unfair response. And then you can use conceptual grounding from the concept of fairness in order to critique whether in fact that's true. And you can use other principles to say, but it ought also to be just, and how's just different from fair? And you can work your way through that. And you can also decide that it ought to be incorporated into codes of ethics and principles and the kinds of skills that you teach nurses or computer engineers or a variety of professions. I want to make it clear that the normative value originates in the phenomenology of the experience itself. It's not magic that happens when we turn it into grounding, but there is this felt sense of binding that comes from many, if not most of them. And so we can take things like compassion and say that, yes, they have this kind of felt moral demand, but also we can involve them in skill and routine. For instance, as I've suggested in nursing. We can do the same things with things like duty and oath, and they have primarily their approach in, this is an empirical question, actually. How do these things get taken up? And what is the experience of it, and how are they different from each other, depending upon the different backgrounds that people come to with it? So already we're at a point where we're winning something from trying to make some kind of a landscape. We're getting some new interesting questions. And then there's the rational concepts, the rational moral import experiences, and when you go through some of these arguments, at the end you get an aha, yeah, that ought to be the case. There's actually some famous neuroscience research about that if you don't get the aha experience for people who have certain lesions in their brain, they can do alphabetizing, but they can't quit. Because there's not that feeling of yeah, I'm done now. So this is where they're taken up. The top table is essentially the chapters from the book: personality, self and identity, expertise. A lot of that work has been done by Darcia Narvaez and Dan Lapsley. Reflective cognition, intuitive cognition. John Haidt has been involved in a lot of that. Emotion, Daryl, you've been involved in a lot of that emotion research. And my claim is that different kinds of moral import experience will be taken up differently into these different domains. And we'll look at that in just a second. But we also need to think about the social domains that they're taken up into. For instance, roles of mother or uncle or a mom. I've mentioned nursing before. My father was a Mason, and there are ways you're supposed to act as somebody who has that practice. And institutions, for instance, law institutionalizes the idea of retribution. Which connects then to the idea of revenge. And software and roads and electrical grids and these sorts of things. There's a lot of literature in the science and technology studies work that does suggest how moral impulses, moral considerations are actually built into the architecture themselves, which is why courthouses look the way they do, or cathedrals look the way they do. So here then is the map. If you take these three different forms of grounding across the psychological domains and across the moral ecology domains, where there can be a response to them. They can be integrated into professions and into practices and the training. They can be integrated into preferences in personality. It's not as easy to do at the trait level, but you can easily talk about how it gets integrated at the narrative level. And here I'm using Dan McAdams' distinctions between the three levels. And then at that middle level of personality differences, like social responsibility. And so to give you an example that makes it a little easier, let's think about compassion. So I have this coded light simply because not all professions have compassion encoded into them, but nursing is clearly one that does that. Psychology, clinical psychology also has that coded into as a part of what it is to be a clinical psychologist. There are roles that have both conceptual aspects. When we talk about how it has changed what it means to be a father in the United States today than it used to be 50 years ago. But compassion has significant ways of being incorporated into intuitive cognition and into emotion, partly through the kind of training that happens in professions. But the cover of the book also has the Good Samaritan on it. And the crucial line in that story is he was moved by compassion. And it was just the thing to do at the time. So he got off his donkey. We can also look at duty. And duty has, and the point here isn't, do I have the right boxes? Because those are empirical questions that would be very helpful to study, because it would help us figure out how these kinds of moral import experiences get integrated into personality, and where, under, and in what professions, and all those sorts of things. But the point is simply that they're going to differ from one to another, and they're going to be taken up differently. Here is another, which is revenge. And I've mentioned already that there's even a conceptual apparatus in the institutions, legal institutions, about how revenge ought to be done. One of my favorite literatures is the saga literatures out of Iceland, where the culture is moving from a culture of revenge to a culture of law. So what does this approach to understanding how moral import experiences are taken up by us? I think it serves as a kind of constraint on what ought models of moral formation be explaining. So they often talk about how do we respond to moral demands, but they often don't talk about the whole variety of ways that these moral demands are taken up, and how they integrate and critique each other. But that's a central part of what moral formation is like. Some of my computer science students have talked about the emotional benefit that they get from working on teams to design ethical software for their clients, and to be able to put words to that emotional content, and to recognize that it comes from being in a team that cares about these things, is part of what has kept some of my computer science students in the profession. And how are these things then coordinated? If we know then how they get in, we can ask questions about how do they influence each other? How does identity connect with emotion? And then how do they stabilize and adapt over time? And speaking of stabilizing and adapting over time, I want to use the table a little differently now to talk about two what I would call moral exemplars. Anybody familiar with Thomas Merton? A monk from the 1960s who got in trouble with the Catholic Church because of writings unbecoming a monk, which were his writings on social justice during the civil rights time. But he led a life that was really quite structured in terms of roles and practices and organizations and institutions, the church generally, and infrastructure. Patrick just took me over to a very nice hotel on campus, and it looked to me like a cloister walk that they have in monasteries. And so even the architecture supports the kind of moral ecology that those people are influenced by. And then here's Liz Cheney, a Republican who decided that the party had moved away from her, and she changed her response over time based upon the kind of the way her moral ecology had changed. Now, the one thing I want you to notice about these two is that there's lots of dark boxes in each of these, because these are people that have deep moral commitments that they have practiced over and over time. But Liz Cheney and Thomas Merton are not like each other. And so the differences that come has got to come from differences of meaning and identity and shaping of emotional response from within those domains. And what I'm doing is suggesting to you the structure that we've got that makes it so difficult to say overall that Thomas Merton and Liz Cheney share a virtue. If what you're going to do is to talk about a shared psychological underpinning for that virtue, it's just going to look very different in the way it's integrated into their lives. So what does this approach, this landscape approach to moral psychology do for us? I think it sets some constraints on us for what any reasonable approach to moral psychology is going to need to explain. First, it's going to have to explain this wide variety of moral experience that we have. My list is just one I have come up with. I need to figure out some systematic ways to improve it. If you have suggestions, I'd be happy. We need to recognize that moral functioning and its stabilization arises from coordinated systems, and begin asking questions about how that coordination happens across personality. And I know we're talking about complex statistical issues here, but in order to understand it, we may need to develop those approaches, or we may need to go to more qualitative approaches, like Dan McAdams has done with his narrative work. One of the things that's crucial is the conceptual level, because it allows critique. And this approach helps us to understand, this approach helps us to understand how sometimes we fully own what we do, and sometimes we just simply do it automatically without attention. We are compassionate because we're a nurse. Or the systems that we inhabit or are part of do it for us. And we can critique it. And that is the work that we got yesterday in the book, Somebody Should Do Something. And sometimes a map like this helps us understand why we might not know what to do, because of the complexity of the kinds of commitments that we might have. Some research questions I think that come up out of this. Is moral stability best built by engaging these different grounding modes within a single moral ecology? Is it best to learn it in a profession and then spread out, in a family and then spread out? How does that spreading out over time work? And is it conceptual that helps it work? Some of Kohlberg's work about education and moral development suggests that conceptual stuff might at least be part of it, but there may be other kinds of grounding. It may be that you need cultural experience, broader cultural experience, in order to feel the emotions that come from the participation in another culture. I don't think we lose virtue in this understanding. In fact, I think we understand its role a little better, rather than thinking of it as a causal conglomeration of a bunch of bits of psychology. Instead, we think of it as a way to identify patterns of virtuous action and to orient our own and other people's moral formation and moral aspirations, and to critique ourselves and systems. So we can talk about corrupt organizations. There's a large literature in organizational psych about that. But we can do the same thing with situationism and say, look, situationism isn't just a negative critique of virtue. In fact, what it is it helps us understand how our moral lives are scaffolded by all the things that are around us and by the roles and institutions and even the buildings that we inhabit. And so we can take both of those approaches and help them talk to each other in this way. With people like Thomas Merton, who had a whole social ecology that helped him to become the kind of person he would become. And by the way, he had to wait for his abbot to tell him it was okay before he could write those books. So my conclusion is that our moral life is both more integrated and more fragmented. And that this landscape can help us try to figure out how and why. And we'll end with this nice picture. I'd be happy to have comments,
Yeah, so if anyone on
complaints.
Oh,
No?
definitely. We can go for a little bit. I mean, we started a little bit late because of the figuring out the Zoom in this room.
That's right, we're at noon.
It's,
I'm
but
standing between you and lunch.
I think there's, we could take definitely a few minutes for questions, I think, unless, depending on how hungry people are. If anyone online has any questions, please drop them in the chat. How do you feel about taking?
I'm happy to take a couple of questions now, and then we can talk about it over lunch too.
I mean, I will say that as I mentioned when I was introducing you, like, as someone who got into moral psychology through these debates over person-situation interactions, your focus on ecology is really interesting. And I think as you noted in your talk, it raises a variety of really interesting questions about what to study and how to study it. I do see, common threads between what you're talking about and the Kelly and Brownstein, we are each other's situation and
Right.
this the ecology.
Absolutely.
We co-create ecologies.
Thank you for setting that up for me.
Well, as you mentioned in your book, your talk. But I'm also seeing some interesting connections with, Lindauer's talk on the fruitfulness of normative concepts.
That's
and,
right.
Like, how do we think about what a concept like virtue does for us?
That's right.
Or any of the specific examples, like a concept like compassion.
Right.
If we cast it through these different these different roles, different domains. I guess my question for you would be one comment and a question.
Okay.
One more comment. The comment would be, I think it's interesting to see how structure can matter so much for some people. And the idea
I'll structure them out. What?
how structure can matter a lot for some people.
Right.
So how, the routines can help people and provide scaffolds that can otherwise maybe build certain kinds of internal psychological responses that help them.
Or deconstruct.
Or deconstruct, yeah. And I guess I'd be curious your thoughts. I have conflicting intuitions about one part of that. Like, on the one hand, I could see how for some people having the routine you mentioned the monastic structure and how that helped Merton.
Right.
But how having a continued structure could help to provide a scaffold and a on-ramp to certain kinds of moral virtues in some cases.
Right.
But there also seems to be the fluidity of domains themselves that we occupy. The classic social psychology point that I can toggle between being a psychologist or a father or someone who
That's
does
right.
coffee and there's different
Code switching.
Yeah, exactly. Code switching gets to this nicely. And that seems to, it's the flexibility of being able to toggle between structures also sort of seems like a useful thing to cultivate too. And I'm just curious, your thoughts about the flexibility with which we put ourselves in different situations and how that kind of butts up against the idea of situational structure as a moral
Right.
growth.
Well, if we look at Schwartz's value circumplex, one of them is one that sounds really familiar in the Big Five also, which is an openness to experience versus tradition. And I think you're going to find that there are personality characteristics that are going to interact with that. So some people aren't going to be able to thrive unless they have some kind of structure to the things. And other people aren't going to be able to thrive unless they have variety. And I don't think it's a point of either or. It's really a point of what's the right balance for each individual. And this is what is part of what makes moral formation difficult. And part of why virtue language often doesn't fit, because when I say be honest, the person who wants real structure wants to know really what that means, and the other person says, oh, how can I work with that? Where will I go with that? And so you're going to have to think about moral formation differently depending upon the personality characteristics, but also the identity commitments and the emotional regulation capacities that people, and all of those are linked, that people are going to have. And so moral formation then becomes much more of an individual mentorship than a process. We have I wanted to show you this. We've actually got a grant from the Educating Character Initiative out of Wake Forest to implement some of this model at St. Olaf College. And part of the way we do it is by embedding it in local moral ecologies. The team sports versus the individual sports. How are the virtues different, or what does it mean to be a thoughtful team member? But also ensemble music, chemistry. We have an undergraduate engineering program. All of those would have a slightly different way of helping those people. But the nice thing about it is that it catches them where their identity is. And that's a lever for the thing they care about. It catches them at, I want to be a good journalist. I want to write about justice or injustice. And then you learn the right ways to do that that are the most effective. But that makes moral formation less of a 7-step program and really more of one expert talking with another, with a budding expert about how they're going to grow up in that moral ecology. And then how do you move from there, from the team sports to the chemistry lab or to the choir? And those, to me, are empirical questions that this poses for folks in a way that I think can actually be measured and thought about. I don't know if that's a good answer.
No, it is. It is. I'm trying to sort through which of the 10 follow-up questions to ask you. Do other folks have questions? Thoughts for Chuck? Either in person or online. If you're online, just drop something in the chat. I can speak it on your behalf.
That's all right with me. That's all right with me. I
do
can eat lunch.
appreciate how you're taking, like Haidt talks about with the social intuitionist model, how this is supposed to, and how he defines morality. It's supposed to include the organizational, institutional layers, but it's typically not, even though.
But it drops out of almost all of those analyses and
Yeah.
it becomes just intuition.
And so I do like how you are trying to add specificity to what organizational ecological factors could play a role, but also avoiding you're allowing that it's going to be necessarily interactional and be very idiosyncratic depending upon the ecologies in question.
And personality psychology, moral formation work, even some work in monastic formation ways of being thoughtful about these interactions. And I think that those are sandboxes that we could use. I'm open to any process theories that help us find explanation in these areas. It's not a process theory. It's really just a set of constraints of the stuff we have to try to explain.
So can I ask you one more question? I want to move on.
Sure.
So you mentioned technology and your interest in psychology and computers and technology more generally. You know, as you think about ecologies of interaction, it seems like your framework provides an interesting lens through which to think about evolving debates about human-tech interaction. Like what ecologies provide people the opportunities to exercise skills like compassion or even like revenge, you know, people who use technology to exact revenge or humiliation.
Oh yeah, doxing.
Exactly. And so I just wondered if you, from your experiences with the technology space, have your thoughts about changing moral ecologies and how we should, does that accelerate our need to focus more on an ecological level of analysis, or is there anything that speaks to you from your experience with that space?
I have taught for 15 years, I just retired, a course called Ethical Issues in Software Design. And what the students in that course did was they consulted for an outside client and helped the outside client think through the ethical issues associated with a piece of software that they were thinking of replacing or redesigning, or a new piece of software. Some of them were, in fact, social networks that would help with mentoring of children, etc. And the things that the computer science students learned were some social science methods that helped them do interviews and coding of those interviews, questionnaires, to find out what the perspectives were of a variety of different kinds of users. And they were surprised that ended up really making a difference in the software that they would recommend, and the design specifications they recommended for the software. And one of the things I would suggest is that that be a standard part of the human-computer interaction requirements. There is a human-computer interaction requirement from the Association for Computing Machinery, IEEE, et cetera. That kind of education of skills in design, in thinking through the ethical issues, because they don't know how to do it. And that's why the skills box here is so, the column here is so important. The computer scientists might think they ought to do it, but it's very easy for them to say, I don't have any idea how to do that. Or maybe they don't want to admit they don't have any idea how to do it, and they just say, oh, that's somebody else. Look at how cool this is. Because in getting a product that works, that at least compiles, right, is an issue for them. But some of these other, and also, by the way, these kinds of skills in the design of software are things that are going to be a little harder for AI to automate for them. And they can then, so I think this is a way to change computer science, computer engineering, and education to think carefully about this kind of moral formation. And I have the ear of some folks that I tend to chew on that. But
well, looking forward to seeing how this develops.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for presenting. And yeah, if anyone has any more questions for Dr. Huff, please feel free to drop them in the chat or talk more with us over lunch. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.